General trial.
General
Thank
trial,
you.
okay.
Yes.
And so that's everything except for
Yes.
domestic violence.
We call non-domestic violence general trial.
Okay.
So general trial deals with OUIs, assaults, property crimes. The next thing I wanted to show you is this one that says cases received from APD. Has domestic violence on the top, general trial on the bottom. This is just sort of the incoming volume that comes to our office. You can see how over the last 5 years, domestic violence cases have crept up. But if you look down at general trial in the far right column, if you look at 2016, you can see how they went up dramatically in 2016. And that's probably due to a number of factors, but that load has gone up. It makes sense that if there are more officers on the street, they're always going to prioritize DV calls, would be my guess. So I would defer to the experts. But if they have more officers, then they're able to respond to more property crimes. And yes?
Well, I'm looking to say in 2016 domestic violence went up dramatically.
2016.
Yeah, it went from 1897 to 2062.
That's 14 to 15. But I mean, that actually looks kind of like 2,000 a year to me.
17 to 18 was pretty dramatic.
Are you looking at the domestic violence totals?
Yeah, I mean, my Broadway doing this, we got a couple thousand a year.
Right.
But if you look at general trial, we got to get back to 2015. It was a third of any of the other stuff. Why was that so low?
That is a good question,
16.
and I'm not sure.
15.
You're right, 2015 was, yes.
Can we
was
do that
lower.
again? Let's figure that out.
Would have been more possible.
Well, not having incoming cases doesn't mean crime isn't happening. Right.
Something went on.
I think we need to training here to talk about solar.
You're alluding to the idea that there may have been an increase in all officers in that year. Is that
No, after that year.
Yeah, Mr. Peterson. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had fewer officers in 2015, and we started having additional academies in 2016 and been building the police force back up ever since then.
Mr. Gates?
Thanks. Could you also remind us with SB9 what changed the corresponding changes? That changed a lot, I guess. The crimes that
2016 was SB 91. There's also some changes to the bail schedule, which changed how people got out of jail during pretrial release.
Which doesn't affect the statistics.
It could affect the statistics, yes.
Like they skip.
A lot of crimes in 2016 became mandatory OR release, which means that judges were not allowed to keep them in jail while they waited trial.
But that doesn't affect arrests.
Well, and violating conditions of relief ceased to
Okay.
be a crime in 2016, so people could get picked up on multiple new charges while they were awaiting their initial case to resolve. Thank you.
Now you finished.
I have, let's see, just a couple more things. This sheet that says open and then declined and then dismissals. Everyone got it? This might be too much information. It's kind of confusing to read. But 6,740 new cases were opened in 2019. Is the very short version of this. And I can field any questions you have about individual lines.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Chair?
Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when you say cases,
Mhm.
do you mean, so for example, let's say the police encounter someone who is on drugs and assaulting folks in their home. it's usually like 7 charges, right? I mean, it's
Yes.
you've assaulted everybody in the house, and you've got a drug charge, and you've got disturbing the peace, and you've got maybe whatever else. Is that one case?
That is
or
one
that
case.
7
Thank you for
cases?
clarifying that. Yes, that's one case.
Okay, it's my case.
Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you. And then if I just pick a year like the 2019, it said there were 6,740 cases open, but then if you look down to the bottom, it says 13 found guilty. Does that
So-
mean that those cases could still be open? Some of those, okay, so.
Well, yes,
so-
some could be open, but the majority of our cases where we get convictions are people who plead out.
Okay.
So that guilty was just by trial. Those were just trial guilties. We have thousands of cases where people plead guilty.
Okay, but you don't have that number in.
No, I don't.
Okay,
Right.
okay,
It's
okay.
not in the-
Because I was just
yeah.
thinking, that's pretty bad odds, that's 6,000 and then
Oh,
you end up
13?
with
No, no,
20.
no, no.
13
No,
would actually
the-
get convicted, then why bother, right?
And I
Why
can
bother?
get that number if you'd like, the percentage where we get a guilty plea, because that might be very illuminating. So I can get that number for you.
All right, great, thanks.
Mr. Kennedy. Continue.
That was it, thank you.
Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so, out of the 6,000 plus cases, 32 is all that actually went to trial?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very high percentage to plead out, isn't it?
I should clarify though, getting a case to plead out doesn't mean, that's a fair amount of work. I mean, it's not the same as doing a trial, but, that involves, getting the offers out and then negotiating and.
Mr. Rowe.
It would help if you would define these terms. Like, I don't know what response to defense, closed probation.
Okay, so, which one did you say?
Well, so.
Go down all of them?
Open means they're arrested and they go to you guys.
A case was
Yes.
sent to us, we open the case.
Okay, so
Yep.
declined means.
Decline means we were sent the charges and we declined to prosecute them.
And that, you didn't think you had enough to succeed. Is that what that?
There's many reasons why a case could be declined. It could be that we don't think there's enough evidence for probable cause. It could be that we declined the charge but added it on to another open case as another count. So sometimes we consolidate cases. It could be that, there's many reasons it could have been declined.
And then can we go through this? Because
Well, yeah,
dismissal-
I'm interested in one dismissed too. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand really any of these.
So a
Motion granted,
dismissal,
I don't-
right, no, it's-
That means something very different for us, sort of. We make a motion and someone seconds. But that probably means something different for you.
So a dismissal is when we've opened a case and then we dismiss it after we opened it. A decline means we never took it in the first place. So a case can be dismissed for a lot of reasons. It could be that evidence gets stale. For example, if we lose a witness or a victim. It could be that it was dismissed as part of a bigger global plea offer with another case. It could be because someone works through a deferred sentencing agreement where they have to meet certain conditions, and if they get anger management, we agree to dismiss a case. So there's many different reasons why a case would be dismissed.
So, it's been represented that sometimes you're waiting a long time for some lab results to get back, and you run into the speedy trial kind of thing.
Yes, so I actually looked at some tox reports and from January. It looks like basically the turnaround for the drug toxicology reports are about 4 months now, 3 to 4 months. So what we've been doing in our office, we found a way, and they are capable of rushing a particular case if we ask. So we've come up with a workaround where we just don't file the charges until we get the results in.
So,
And that's been working for us now, so.
So is the person incarcerated while they're waiting?
No, there is no case open against them until we get the blood results.
So then they may be still out doing whatever activities they were doing before.
That's true. But it makes our case stronger so that we can actually prosecute.
Chief Dahl.
Chief Dahl, please.
Thank you, Mr.
You
Chair.
can come up here and sit if you like.
Okay, I would be happy to do that. I just wanted to throw in on top of that with the types of cases that the municipal prosecutor's office typically handles, I would say that in a lot of cases, even if charges are filed immediately, it's likely the offender is probably out on the street while the adjudication process is happening.
That's a very
So
good point.
I just thought it would be helpful to make that clarification.
Yeah, so if there's blood toxicology, a significant percentage of those are allowed to be driving offenses.
Typically, so I think that right now we're talking about drug screening with blood, which is different than alcohol screening.
Right.
And the alcohol screening is typically coming back in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. So, have you had cases that while you're waiting to charge, and you're waiting to charge because of blood toxicology, there's been reoffenses?
Not that I can't think of a specific case off the top of my head. So every once in a while, we do get someone with multiple DUIs. They're all open at the same time, but I can't think of one where that was due to waiting for blood work.
Chief, what other arrests you make besides that have the drug issue besides driving when you've been going for driving?
There could be other things. Sometimes if it's like a case with a special victims unit, some sort of sex assault, there could be some element where the blood testing is required to determine some level of intoxication or impairment or other problems that may have been a result of something in someone's blood. It could happen with other violent crimes as well. It's not as common. By far the most common are driving offenses.
Any other questions? Please continue.
Closed or on probation means what it says. That's how many cases closed that year. So the case is ended, even if the person's on probation, the case is over. I'm going to skip the motions part and appeals part because that's somewhat complicated. I'm happy to have conversations later if people want to get into it.
So what you're saying there is you're busy doing stuff. Is that my takeaway from that?
From what?
But you guys, as far as staff, this
Mhm.
means you're busy doing stuff on these cases.
Yes. Mhm. Yep.
Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so then I'm confused. If we have 6,700 cases open,
Mhm.
and we decline to prosecute 2,300, we dismiss 1,300, how do we end up closing 6,123?
So the declines are not included in that open number
The declines are not, okay,
because there are cases that were never opened.
Okay, got it, and that would be.
And also, every year, we don't start over fresh every year. You have old cases from the year before.
Well, and
or
that's
the
what I
year
was trying to
before
figure
that.
out too, is
Right.
how we can look at it year
Right.
by year.
And that's why I showed you that initial numbers of case assignment by alphabet, because that captures how many cases are open in a year, not just cases open that year. So yeah, it's a constant turnover of cases.
Okay.
It's really hard to get a snapshot.
Yes, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, do you have many leave the state?
Attorneys or defendants? Defendants?
Defended.
Did
I didn't know your working conditions were that bad.
No, our working conditions are pretty good. I don't know where they all go. I can say this year in 2019, we had 390 cases that are just on warrant status that never left that status. So people disappear, they disengage from their court cases. I don't know if they're in the state or out of the state.
390, is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, how much of a problem is that, Chief?
Depends on what they're doing when they're not
Yeah.
going to court like they're supposed to.
And we have very little capacity for supervising people that are released or pretrial.
Well, we work hard to get the judges to order conditions of release. We can do some restrictions through the pretrial enforcement division, such as
With DV.
yeah, wait.
So with domestic violence, we have officers assigned to do sort of follow-up on people that have been released with conditions, making sure they're obeying those conditions.
Is that bracelets or anklets?
I don't think so.
So we have 2 officers in our department who actually do compliance checks to make sure DV offenders are not contacting their victims. And they can work with the pretrial enforcement division to find out when someone's ankle bracelet says they're where they shouldn't be, and then they can go follow up. But they also do their own independent work to check on people.
But that's the electronic monitoring is not something that APD specifically does.
Right.
Yeah.
But you have a contractor,
No.
so that's all state?
State.
So that's all just felonies?
No, misdemeanors.
Okay.
Domestic violence.
So, on domestic violence one, there's probably a restraining order in place, or judge orders and stuff. But can we put the bracelets or anklets on that have a GPS in them, tell them if they're staying out of the area they're told to stay out of?
Well, to do that, we ask the judge to assign them to the pretrial enforcement division so they can be supervised.
Does that work?
Yeah, for the most part. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if we do have some people that leave state before their trial comes up, if they get arrested in another state, do we find out about that, or sometimes we do, or?
Not for misdemeanors generally.
So if this person got arrested in another state, they wouldn't check his previous residences to see if he had outstanding warrants or anything?
You can answer that.
Yeah,
I can.
they do, and we do as well, but typically states do not extradite for misdemeanors. So you have to have, in order to, so if I check somebody that I've had contact with for wants and warrants, and they show up with even a felony warrant from another state, that state has to say, we're willing to extradite them from whatever state you're in. And what's interesting is, in the lower 48, a lot of states will extradite from surrounding states, so the states that touch their border, but not anywhere else. And so it's very common to see, oh, this person has an outstanding warrant for a felony in, South Dakota, to pick one at random, and but they will only extradite from surrounding states, so they won't extradite from Alaska.
And I would assume economics is a part of that?
Oh, for sure.
What would just give me a number of it take to put somebody on our line, send a guard with them to Nevada or somewhere?
I can't even remember the last time we did that, so I mean.
But it's got to be at least 5,000, right?
Yeah, it would be in the thousands, I would think, just because you have to buy a ticket for 2 officers, because you wouldn't send somebody by themselves, plus the defendant, and of course all their other travel costs associated. It's not cheap, and that's honestly something. If we APD were going to do that, we have to. I mean, we don't have policies or procedures or training to do those things because it's just not part of our normal realm. We'd probably look for troopers or U.S. Marshals to do that.
Any other questions? All right, please continue.
Oh, and the last piece of paper I had was just so you can see what our office prosecutes. It's a list of count by case type. So on this, you can see that we spend a lot of our time prosecuting assaults, especially DV assaults, OUIs, and refusals, which are the same as a DUI, more or less.
What is an OUI?
Oh, DUI, operating under the influence.
Oh, it's
yeah. So you can get an idea of what takes most of our time. So I hope that was somewhat helpful. I realize you're not in my office every day, so I thought maybe you'd want a snapshot of what we're doing.
And the ones on trespass, 590.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, tell me about the majority of those. What
Most
kind?
of them are business trespasses. So people have been trespassed for the Diamond Center and the Fifth Avenue Mall and cars and Safeway because of theft. So the theft numbers and the trespass numbers go mostly hand in hand.
And then we charge it both, right?
If they were stealing that time, yeah.
So would the 590 show up, is that duplicate? Have you put both charges in, or there's, where is the theft?
So,
Theft, that's only 95? So 590 cases, 95 of them were maybe theft?
There may be another subsection of theft. Let me see. Yeah, that's why I was seeing if there's a shoplifting one. We have a number of different codes for theft, and I'm thinking we might have left one off of here. There's another code for shoplifting. So there's shoplifting, theft, there's concealment of merchandise, there's several different names for theft.
Yeah, so then if it was shoplifting and trespass, both numbers would
Oh,
show
yeah,
up on
yes,
this
you're right.
chart.
Mhm.
Yeah, so you can't add all these up and come up with a number of,
Cases, no.
yeah, all right. That might be helpful. Of all of these, maybe Chief, you comment too, of all these, on this one, which of those are felonies?
None of these are felonies. They're all misdemeanors.
Yeah, so assaulting a police officer is not a felony?
No.
Depends on how you do it.
Yeah, right.
That's not a hurdle rate that I need to know. But,
Yeah.
So, so prostitution,
That,
practicing.
sorry, that was a typo.
Practice.
Yeah, I believe that one was dismissed. That was a dismissed case, but there was only one of them.
Okay, but is
Practicing, yes.
is a felony
Nope.
misdemeanor?
So-
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So resisting arrest or interfering with a police officer isn't a felony?
Not if you do it in certain ways.
Yeah, again, it depends a little bit. Generally, I would say most of those types of offenses tend to be misdemeanors. There is a way that you could potentially do it and have it be a felony, but generally speaking, when we think of resisting arrest cases, they're usually misdemeanors.
Can I ask
Yes.
something, Mr. Dyson?
Mr. Davis?
Thank you. And those probably span a range of someone doing really crazy things versus someone, no, you're not allowed. I mean, right?
That's a great question. So yeah, I mean there is almost all of these fit that category, but with resisting it could just be very simply that they're sort of passively resistant. Although honestly, we typically don't charge those.
That one.
Yeah. Usually there has to be we had to fight some to get you in the handcuffs kind of thing to get to where we're going to charge that. Somebody that's just sort of not compliant but not really fighting. We call it sort of passive resistance. We don't usually charge those people unless it creates some additional complication. And then, of course, people that are fleeing from us and we're having a chase or track with canine or there's smash cart, all those things. I mean, that's a pretty extreme level behavior, and then that potentially could fit in there, although if it's really bad, typically it does trigger some kind of felony behavior. And then you wouldn't see it here because even if we charged a misdemeanor level of resisting, but there was a companion felony charge, then the district attorney would get it, and it would all be sort of wrapped together in that one case kind of deal.
Thank you.
Does that answer?
Either of you, would you explain to me when the abuse of a child or a vulnerable adult or assault DV becomes a felony?
Would be based on seriousness of harm and how many incidents there were, I believe.
And especially for the any assault really, whether it's domestic violence or there's no domestic relationship, it's the level of harm, but also whether or not some sort of weapon was used or other kind of surrounding circumstances can elevate that to a felony. And a lot of the person type crimes have similar circumstances associated with them to make them either misdemeanor or felony. Any kind of weapon is almost always going to make it some kind of felony.
And serious injury?
Correct, serious injury, even if there's not a weapon involved. And then you start getting into some hair splitting over, it's not a weapon, but even hands and feet can be weapons depending on the circumstances. And so,
where is dealing drugs?
That's not a misdemeanor.
Sorry?
That's not a misdemeanor, so we don't.
That's not on there, so any dealing.
Right.
usually.
There's,
For your information, up until the efforts of Mr. Dunbar, any amount, measurable amount in your vehicle was a felony.
To be fair, you also played a large role in that, Mr. Dyson.
He did the research.
Complimenting you
Then
or
Senator
criticizing
Dyson.
you.
No,
And
compliment.
managed in one fell swoop to aggravate almost everybody in the Department of Law.
It's true.
You must be talking
I'm
about
not
specific
sure
case because
what
neither
you're
one of us
referencing.
is tracking.
I don't know- I
No,
know
we
not
worked on
either.
a bill that was back in 2012, 2013, that reduced certain low-level, non-violent drug felonies to misdemeanors. But didn't pass.
Any measurable amount is in your car and your kid's friend left it there, it was still a felony on the books. Not many of them got prosecuted. Anyways, any other questions, Ms. Kennedy?
Thanks, Mr. Dyson. There is a synthetic drug, though. There's possess or consume illicit synthetic drug. There hasn't been anybody charged with that, but what is that?
That's a spice.
Is it
From a few
okay.
years ago, do you remember
Yeah,
the spice?
So we're not finding the spice
epidemic?
anywhere anymore. Huh?
It seems to be less of an issue in terms of what's coming into my office.
It was, I think it's still around, but we're certainly not having the massive episodes that we did that frankly involved the fire department as well, pretty substantially. Fortunately, it's not.
Oh,
Ms. Quinn
I was
Davis.
going to follow up on Ms. Kennedy's question, but that would include probably cocaine or, I mean, aren't those, isn't
No,
that
the
synthetic?
synthetic drug was the spice.
So,
But meth would be a.
Yeah, I mean,
Is it-
those aren't
no, so
naturally occurring.
where it gets a little confusing is you're right, like from a chemistry perspective, it's not like a naturally occurring substance, although some of them have natural bases, right?
Right,
Like
like
cocaine or
cocaine.
heroin. But those are what we typically refer to as scheduled substances. They're controlled substances under the federal schedule of controlled substances, and then which the state sort of imports into state law as well. And so this particular municipal code that would show up here, I think, was designed specifically for the it's called spice. It was called K2 for a while, synthetic marijuana, all kinds of different names, and they were things that were had a narcotic effect, and probably the fire chief could describe the medical portion better than I can, but they weren't part of that schedule of controlled substances, so we had some really hard times dealing with them because it was not a classic drug offense, but it also was like highly problematic and not good for people and creating a massive load on the first responder system. And so the assembly at the time put some things in place to try to help regulate that a little bit. And I think in some ways it was successful because it's at least
Right, and, please introduce yourself for the record.
Deanna's acting municipal attorney. What they found back then too, in that period of time, was that most of the dealing was actually from head shops. And so they made it a civil fine, like $500 per item that you sold, and it eliminated much of that versus finding that one person on the street in the back corner.
Ms. Quinn Davis.
I don't want to hog the show from the, okay. It's interesting to me that 3 times as many domestic violence assaults as just sort of your regular assault occur. I think we hear a lot more about car theft and maybe general assault, fights. We know domestic violence is a problem, but it's a huge problem. So is there any reason that the data here don't accurately reflect what's really going on? Like, are some regular assaults, non-DV assaults, felonies or end up getting prosecuted by the state? Like, I just want to understand, this makes it look like 3 out of 4 assaults are domestic violence in the muni, but can you help me understand if that's right?
I think so. So if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're right. There are non-domestic violence related assaults that are shown here, and then obviously a lot that are. And with the state, it's the same. So we have lots of felony assaults and misdemeanor assaults that for whatever reason end up with the district attorney that are not domestic violence related. But there's also a very healthy number that are DV related. Mm-hmm. And I think that I don't have any actual data to support that. I would just tell you, like, based on my own impression, I think a lot of the misdemeanor assaults that we go to tend to be domestic violence related, because if you think about the world and who you are most closely associated with and who tends to irritate you the easiest, it's people that are that you have a domestic relationship with. And I think those things tend to escalate into assaults that then the police department responds to. I also will just mention that, for example, on a not domestic violence related assault where perhaps the police department is called, there are two people involved, one person appears to be the victim of an assault, but that person is maybe not interested or willing to participate in an arrest and an adjudication process. We might allow them to say, I really don't want to have anything to do with this. We had a tiff, but it's over. I'm good, whatever. Well, with domestic violence, that's not the case. Once we get involved, we are on a trajectory that cannot be altered. And if we find probable cause that a crime occurred, we're going to make an arrest. We're required to make a physical arrest by law. So I think that that's another point that maybe you could see some divergence between what's happening in the world and what ends up getting reported to the various prosecuting agencies, if that makes sense. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
Can I ask a follow-up, Mr. Chair? So are those numbers similar with the crimes that the state is prosecuting, would you expect? I just want to make sure
I've
this
never
isn't
seen their
totally
numbers,
skewed.
but I would expect that
Okay.
it would be
I
similar.
feel like it should be
Yeah.
somewhat relative, but I actually don't know for sure.
It just occurs to me that we don't talk about that as much as we talk about some of the other crimes, and it's a huge problem. So thanks for doing work to try to alleviate that.
My memory is meth labs are dangerous. And not only catch on fire and stuff, but if you got little kids crawling around the floor on an apartment where there's been a meth lab, it's really dangerous. Where on here does it talk about people manufacturing drugs? Is that a felony automatic?
It would most likely be a felony, and so the first part of what you said is absolutely. Meth labs catch a fire, they blow up. We went to one, it's been years ago, that blew a building off of the foundation in Spenard, like a 3-story multiplex, so like a large building. And you're right, that it can permanently sort of contaminate that structure and make it really difficult to remediate and be safe to live in again. Generally, that is that kind of drug manufacture would be felony, and you'd probably see it prosecuted by the state and not on this list. However, that is far, far less common than it once was, mostly because it's much easier to produce very chemically pure methamphetamine, like lab grade, either overseas or outside the country, and then import it.
All right. But two more things that are really important. Can you, well, what I want to know is if we are not prosecuting some cases we could just because we're short of resources.
No, I think when we're understaffed, what's more likely to happen is just cases take longer because it's possible to get behind on writing offers or, sort of managing the cases. We try really hard to not take cases because of staffing. So we take pride in taking all the cases we can, but being low staffed will affect how quickly cases resolve.
Say the last phrase again.
Sorry, it will affect how quickly a case resolves.
Yeah, but they just stack up.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, they do.
and that's unfortunate.
Yes.
We all believe that swift, sure justice
Yes.
is
And if we can get through our cases more quickly, it increases our ability to go to trial because we haven't lost witnesses because the case took so long.
sure. And I suspect that staffing issue makes you more inclined to try to get them to plead out.
I'm not sure about that, but it is true that the more staff you have, the lighter your caseload, the more easily and quickly you can get out offers and do trials that are where you can win because it's not a normal case. So.
Okay. Any other questions? Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know how much of a conversation you want to have about this, but just in terms of the cases that you either declined to take or dismissed, and I'm assuming even the dismissal has something to do with lack of evidence or lack of something that you can actually prosecute with. So Obviously, there are some people that literally are innocent, and we want to protect the idea of innocent until proven guilty. But is there a problem in there somewhere with evidence and how that evidence actually makes it to the prosecutor's office, so that you have enough by which you actually could prosecute a case? So, I mean, I guess I'm just saying, is there places there where we can improve training, or I know even sometimes with excuse me, with the rape kits, you know, there's a contamination component there that a lot of times just throws that kit out. And so anyway,
I don't believe there is one evidentiary problem. I think a lot of the times when a case becomes problematic in terms of evidence, it's often because of a human factor where, a witness just disappears, a victim disappears. So it tends to be more kind of that kind of thing rather than any problem with evidence gathering.
Okay. I was just thinking that in terms of, it seems how sophisticated a lot of research and some of the processes for really being able to get at the whodunit.
Right.
Are we lacking in some of that here? Is there something we can?
Misdemeanor prosecution really relies on people witnesses. I mean, if we have a domestic violence trial, it could all just hinge on one person's testimony. So we're often not talking about technical lab type things.
It's not some kind of physical
Right.
evidence.
Right.
It's just somebody's willingness to testify.
So, you and I have talked about this, but there's a lot of theft cases that we don't know who the perpetrator is. And if we had a lot more police investigators, we can find some percentage of the perpetrators. True.
Well, okay, I wasn't sure what the question was, but yeah, so what I will say about that is, like most things, if you have more people, you can get more work done. And so there's a little bit of, I think, a myth sometimes that the threshold for investigating property crimes is somehow monetary, and it's really more based on solvability. But there is screening that happens, and there are cases that probably get screened out for assignment to a detective because they don't appear eminently solvable, that if we had more detectives and you could spend more time on that particular case, you might get to a point where it's solvable. So, I mean, I think that that's a very realistic assessment. And, we have to, like everything we do, there's always resource prioritization.
Pardon my ignorance, but people steal like construction equipment. Is there a threshold at which that becomes a felony?
Well, for every kind of theft, there's a monetary threshold where it becomes a felony.
What is that?
I think it's still $750, right? $750.
I'll bet the state's not taking many of those cases.
I think that again, it's a solvability, and then ultimately, is it prosecutable? I think that if you bring them a good case that is like any attorney's office that's prosecutable, they're going to want to prosecute that. It's just whether or not we're able to develop enough information that it's worthwhile to prosecute, or even ethical to prosecute.
We need to move on. If pretend Bill's not here, how much of a bump in your staff salary, attorneys, would be necessary to keep them, drive down your turnover?
We did just recently work on making the salaries more comparable to salaries with the state and
Just the bottom
nationally.
line.
I think at the moment our salaries are appropriate. I do think, however, I want to see how this new position plays out, but it
Okay,
could be
I got
that
it.
more people would be
Right.
better. But the hard part is maintaining
Right.
the salaries.
So, any more questions on the prosecution end of this?
Can I just follow up, Mr. Dyson, on the salary question? Are prosecutors versus the civil side, is there a different schedule? And so that might not necessarily apply to some of the things Becky was sharing.
Not really different schedules.
Okay.
Definitely different salaries. I think Becky and we've always been interested in keeping attorneys, especially prosecution, to have some type of step system. Right now, we hire someone
Okay.
in.
Right.
Right.
That's the same as
And papers.
All right, so please stay. Let's go on to the B thing here, your report, Chief.
Okay, so I can launch right into what's on here, and then of course always happy to answer questions. But I was sent sort of some supplemental questions, and I tried to answer those as best I could. There was a question about whether or not APD has online fine payment, and we do. There's a convenience fee associated with it, with just like a lot of online fine. I think if you pay a government, whether it's taxes or whatever, a lot of times there's a convenience fee. We're no different.
Was probably the time when I couldn't pay mine online was the only time that ever occurred, right?
I guess I would not choose to speculate on that. I'm looking at the agenda and it's a little out of sync with the stuff I had, so I'm going to roll through the stuff I had, and if I just miss something, we'll circle back to it. So there's a question about police traffic reports and how people could get them for insurance claims and what the timeline was. So we have a third-party provider that allows people to get access to their collision report online, basically as soon as it goes through the approval process, which is typically about 4 days. It depends on a variety of factors. Sometimes it can happen a little faster. But as soon as that happens, then it's instantly available online. It's just that the resident has to pay the fee to the vendor, again, like a convenience fee. And I can't remember the name of the vendor off the top of my head. And there are some restrictions to that. It's the basic crash report that you typically look for insurance claim. But if there's, if it's a crash report that's as a result of, somebody fleeing from the police that was involved in a homicide and all these other complicating factors, then you might not get any of it, or you might just get that basic collision report, but not all the other stuff associated, because it's still going through the adjudication process, so those aren't available for release yet. And then we just spoke briefly about property crime investigations and the triaging of those, but again, based on solvability factors, evidence, suspect ID, overall circumstances, stuff like that. There was another question about timeline for calls for service and initial contact. I think I knew what that was about, and so I looked and I pulled a couple things that I thought were of interest sort of along those lines. So in January of last year, January of 2019, the average 911 wait time was about 15.8 seconds, a little longer than we'd like to have. When you look at sort of the national best practice, it's typically 10 seconds or less. In December of last year, 2019, the average wait time was 11.8 seconds. So a little bit of progress there throughout the year. We've been doing a lot of things to try to make that better. We think one of them, frankly, was implementing 311 and directing the public to use that for non-emergencies and keeping 911 clear for true emergencies. That helps us do that. Plus, of course, we had support last year to add call takers and dispatchers. We've been working our way through that. We think that's making a difference. The prosecutor's office talked a little bit about the toxicology issues, so I think that's been covered. And that was, I think that was the extent of the questions that I had been given, at least for as far as B goes.
So, Chief, I think what we're talking about response time wasn't just for somebody to pick up the phone at 911, but for the police officers to get there. And I think on some shifts at times people have been so overloaded with high priority cases that, the thefts from the home or whatever are often hours, maybe days, probably appropriately given the triage. But please talk about that.
So good. Thank you for bringing me back on point, and because I skipped one of my bullet points. So on average, for a priority 1 call, which is something bad that's happened that you would expect police cars to run lights and sirens to, it takes us about 4.3 minutes to arrive from the time that we first get the 911 call. Which considering how big Anchorage is, and that's an average, that's a pretty decent response time. But Mr. Chair, you're correct in that sometimes, depending on the time of day and the day of the week, we do experience longer wait times. It's harder to break that down because they're so different in the way the calls get prioritized. But my sense is that generally that is getting better. We're not seeing, you were right, for a time there we were seeing hours and hours and hours of wait time, 2-3 years ago when people were, we were experiencing more issues around the city and people were calling and having to wait longer. I feel like those wait times have gotten better as we've deployed more officers onto patrol. And frankly, the average response time for priority 1 calls has gone down as well. So I don't think that it's impossible for that to still happen where we have a longer wait time for something. But again, there's a prioritization system, and we are generally trying to prioritize the things that need to have a response immediately above things that could potentially wait where somebody's life is not, at risk or there's not risk of injury.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So last year you assigned patrol officers to specific community council areas. Do you think that might have helped shorten the response time a little? Because they may know some of those addresses, they may have been to them before, so they're faster. I don't know.
I mean, you're probably not wrong. I think there's probably an element to that, right? You become familiar with your area, you get around a little quicker, you know the problem location, so it probably doesn't hurt. Although, again, I mean, Anchorage in a lot of ways is sort of geographically challenged, right? Like, we're big, we're spread out, and so it takes a while to drive from A to B. We have days like today where things are a little slower than normal.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Kenny.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess in my district, I'm thinking, I appreciate the 4-minute response time, but I'm thinking that that's maybe physically not possible in a lot of places in Chugiak, Eagle River, or Kludna. So do you keep statistics by district in terms of quickest response time? I mean, do you know at what point, you have information that tells you an officer left this location and got to this location, and so you have those time clocks? Well, and then if that's true, then can you give me an idea of kind of what the longest response time could typically be, and at least in my district, because it is so large?
So, I mean, you're right. You're right that sometimes 4 minutes it wouldn't be physically possible to get there that fast, right? Depending on how far you have to drive, and certainly some of the areas of town that are more spread out, like Chugiak Eagle River, or frankly Turning an Arm, right, where you have a much longer drive to get to the problem, could have a longer response time. I don't normally, on a regular basis, break that down by patrol beat, but that's something we certainly could do. What we don't know as well right now with the existing system is where an officer started from when they were first dispatched. We can. In a pinch, we can get that information, but it's not something that's easy.
You don't keep it already.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's there, but not in a way that's useful for this discussion. But we do know the time that they were notified of the call and the time that they actually arrived there. Okay. And that's something that we do have pretty good access to, so that's something that we could try to parse out. So we're taking notes, and we'll try to get you that information.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd be interested in getting a little bit more of a sense of, because it is such a geographically
it's big.
Wide and long.
It's just big.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so as far as the longest call response, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, that's why we tend to talk about these things in averages, because it's like if you happen to get dispatched to a location that you just happen to be driving past, like your response time is like fractions of a second, right?
Yeah.
And if you get dispatched to something that maybe held for a long time before it got dispatched, depending on how we look at that, if we look at it from not 911 call time or even 311 call time to arrival time, that could be a really long window. Sometimes it could be the next day, and some of those things are intentional, but it's hard to sift them out of everything else. So, for example, in Chugiak Eagle River recently, we had a problem at an address. The address is in a geographically challenging location, not just to drive to, but also from a tactical perspective. And this is somebody who actually does not love being contacted by law enforcement. And so when we got that call at like 9 p.m., we intentionally waited until about noon the next day when it was light out, when we were pretty sure we weren't going to surprise anybody and wake them up, and we could have some confidence in making a phone call to maybe coordinate our arrival, right? Those kinds of things to make it safe for everybody involved. But when you just if you just dump data and that call's in there, it's going to look like the police department didn't respond for 18 hours, but that was wholly intentional. So that's where, I mean, just throwing things out there that
that's good.
sometimes complicate this discussion.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So I remember maybe a year ago, Chief and I were talking. I hope that we can get you some more resources. And I think you said at that time, if you got more bodies, you'd have to sign them to 911 and administrative stuff because you were really stressed there. If we get some more revenue from the alcohol tax and literally millions of dollars per year, where will you be our highest priorities for working on that? How would you invest those people?
I think in a combination of ways. We'd probably still add a little bit to dispatch and records and some of the other non-sworn areas of the police department. I really would love to wean dispatch off of operating on overtime in a planned, scheduled way, just to make ends meet every day. So we would continue to work in that direction, because obviously having employees on straight time is far less expensive for the municipality, but it's also way better for the individuals, right? If you're working people way more than their 40 hours a week on a planned weekly basis, like you tend to ruin them, and so that's not good. But also, we're probably going to start investing in, we would invest some of that in more sworn positions, and we'd look to start filling out some of the specialty areas again. We've done some of that already, but we'd probably look to grow like the detective division. Honestly, I feel like growing the traffic unit would be in the city's best interest at this point. I think we all probably hear from people who have concerns about traffic violations around town and the safety or lack of safety with that. So I think we could do that, and it wouldn't take very many people to have a pretty significant felt impact. I always love putting more people on patrol, because more people on patrol is more uniforms out in the community. People see that, they feel safer, we respond to things more quickly, we tend to intervene in criminal activity. So that's like an easy, patrol's almost like a boat, right? It's just like an endless hole that you pour money into. And so we can always put more bodies there, but I think that the initial things that we would look at are, again, some of the non-sworn, but also some of the investigative positions in specialty areas.
Thank you. Any more questions on items A and B? Just quickly then, have they got a new director of crime lab?
I believe they do.
Have they made any progress filling the vacancies?
Their positions?
Their positions.
I have no idea.
Yeah, I'd heard that they'd lost a couple. That's months ago.
I don't know about their individual positions as much as I know about our, functionality and partnering with the crime lab. And I, based on some of the discussions we've had, I've been asking around. That seems to be very good right now, and we think it's going to continue to get better. So, and of course, now we have at least one embedded employee there, the DNA analyst. So, we're working our way through getting that person certified. So
We got somebody hired for that position?
I believe so. Am I imagining that, DC?
You know, Bill? I heard that we were having trouble and weren't paying enough.
It took a while to get somebody hired, because that's a very technical position, but I believe that person came on board at the end of January of this year, and now we're in the process of working her into the lab process. You have to get certified to work in their lab space and sort of jump through lots of hoops to get fully up and running, but I think that's underway. So,
Good.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Falsey. News.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, correct.
Any other questions on A, B, and C? Now, and Ms. LaFrance joined us a few minutes ago. All right, sir.
Mr. Chair, if I could have just a moment, I meant to do this at the beginning, but we got sort of mixed up in talking about prosecutorial things, and then I almost forgot. But I would like to introduce Deputy Chief Mike Curl. Most of you probably remember him as Captain Mike Curl when he was in charge of Crime Suppression Division. And as of yesterday, he is the department's newest Deputy Chief. He'll be Deputy Chief. We're extremely thankful that he was willing to take on that role. He'll be Deputy Chief of Administration. And of course, everybody's favorite, Deputy Chief McCoy, will continue to be Deputy Chief of Operations and in charge of things like detectives and crime suppression and patrol. So it's been a position long vacant at APD, and we're happy to have it filled.
I think I speak from all of our colleagues. We appreciate both of you and what you're doing amongst the highest functions of government. I'm impressed with what you do with the resources you have.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. I'm going to hand the gavel to my senior assembly member here, and he's going to finish the rest of our agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. So I guess we have completed the ABCs of the Public Safety Committee so far, so we'll go down to D. This would be amending AMC 1020, record keeping, conduct of business, reporting requirements, video surveillance, and other requirements of pawnbrokers. And I guess we have a copy of this ordinance here. You want to talk about that, Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Chair. Okay, so this ordinance, the revisions here, came about from a conversation of how do we improve the odds of recovering stolen property. And the original discussion was much broader and involved looking at, can there be bots, to search the internet based on police reports, and Mr. Falsey had brought in the I-team. And over the course of time, it morphed into this, and we were not able to do some of those things we were hoping we could do. And it turned out that the pawn unit had some very specific ideas on how code could be changed to help them in this effort to help people recover stolen property. So this AO introduces some changes, for example, requiring individual photos of jewelry instead of how it's been where there might be a big group of items of jewelry together, which would make it very difficult to identify pieces. It also changes the requirements for video cameras and surveillance so that they are the same as those in code for marijuana establishments. It adds the Alaska statute definition of a firearm and the requirement that it must be confirmed with APD that the firearm associated with that serial number is not stolen, and also further specifies requirements surrounding information and ID. And then at this point, Mr. Sherwood, I think will go ahead and walk us through it. And then is there someone from the pawn? Oh, Bethany, you're right there in front of me. Oh, who has been an absolutely amazing key part. And for the record, Chief Dahl is vigorously nodding his head in the pawn unit. And thank you so much, Bethany, because we would not be at this point without you and then the work of Mr. Sherwood. So if you all want to take it from here, Mr. Chair, if that's okay.
You bet. Go ahead.
So I'm Assistant Municipal Attorney Todd Sherwood, and I drafted this. That's kind of my input, looked at it from a lawyer perspective. I thought it might be good for Bethany as pawn unit clerk to just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what she does, and because my impression is what she does is core to the pawn unit work. There's one of the detectives is here, and I don't know about how all they work, but I think that the detectives are going out solving crimes. My sense is she's the hub of the unit, and I think it would just be useful for the committee to understand how she does her work, how that internal office work, and then you'll understand better the changes they want here and why the request is being made.
Fantastic.
I'm Bethany Jenner. I'm the pawn clerk at APD. So my role, the pawn unit, is actually me and one detective, the pawn detective. So my role is I'm the point of contact for victims. I start the investigation, basically. So pawnbrokers, there are 9 licensed pawnbrokers within the municipality. They report their transactions. They're required to report once weekly to a database. And I can perform searches by pawner, by item description in that database for stolen property. There is also an interface in that database that when somebody reports their property as stolen by serial number, we get a hit when that's been pawned. So there's it's a lot of initiation of cases. So what I'll do is I will then put that property on hold. We'll review the case with the detective. He'll do all the follow-up and the investigation side. But so I start things, and then it goes to the detective once we've established it's a good case. But basically, victims contact me and ask me to look for their items.
Okay, so with that, yeah, I'll just walk through, and I'll often be deferring to Bethany because a lot of this came out of pawn units experience and what would improve the existing ordinance. And I think it's important just for context to understand this. Well, when I was doing some background research on this, it goes back to at least the 1960s that the city of Anchorage has had some kind of pawnbroker licensing record-keeping ordinance. And historically, it's just one of those industries like alcohol that's heavily regulated and always has been. So these are changes, obviously, to an existing ordinance. If you go to page 2 of 9, section 1 and line 9, the only change here is changing hours of operation. When we were going through this and I was doing some research, one of the things to be aware of, there is a state statute that licenses and regulates pawnbrokers. That was passed in 2010 by the state legislature and was effective July 1st of 2011. One of the things that they added in there, and because of a lawsuit that I won't go into, we prevailed on the Superior Court level, I ended up doing a lot of research on the legislative history of the state statute. And one of the things that they had a special carve-out that allowed municipalities to have their own ordinance and regulation, and that it could be more restrictive than what the state had. In enacting that part of the law, they said basically a municipality can do what they want, except they cannot require the payment of a fee or a tax related to a pawnbroker transaction, and we do not do that. And they cannot restrict the hours of operation of a pawnbroker, except that an ordinance may prohibit pawnbrokers from operating as provided in, and then you got to go to another part of the state statute, between the hours of 12 midnight and 6 a.m. All that to say, we found out that our ordinance hours were not in comporting with the state statute. So this is an opportunity to change it. So now it says 12 midnight to 6 a.m. is hours they cannot be open.
Just a second, Mr. Rivera has joined us for the record. Thank you. Continue.
And then the next section, B, there was just a change to take away from the use of the term his and put the. And C, and I think this is a good chance for Bethany to talk a little bit about this. It's just old language talking about a card, and so substituting electronic form, but probably be good to talk about Leads Online and how that works and the importance of having the electronic system.
So Leads Online is a system that APD pays for. The businesses that use it, they do not have to pay to use it. Most industry standard software can easily automatically upload their transaction information through Leads Online. It's just a file transfer, and it's very simple. It takes about a second. So like the Cash America locations and district manager for Cash America's here, they automatically upload every morning. So it's the reason why we wanted to say electronic is because all of these pawnbrokers report their transactions digitally, so that I can search through their transactions.
And then C1, line 20, we added the word transaction just for more specificity. Anything you want to add? Okay. And then going into C2, the main part here, the underlying part, had a lot more specificity about firearms. Among other things, it references the state's definition of firearm, which includes, even if it's not a functioning firearm, so that the firearm serial number specifically has to be reported to the police department, and they can't proceed with any transaction on that until the police department has a chance to run it and see that it's not stolen. Comment on why that's important.
Mr. Whittington.
How quick is that done?
So typically what happens is that an employee of a pawnbroking establishment will just call dispatch, APD dispatch, and they run the serial number. It doesn't take long at all.
11 and a half seconds later, they get an answer and then they ask the question.
Yeah, it doesn't take
0.7 seconds.
long.
Some of those hold times are lengthy because it's a non-emergency line. My name is Brian Eddy. I'm the district manager at Cash America. We operate 6 of the 9 pawnbroking licensed pawnbrokers in England. It is quick. Once we got to some of these instantaneous, but those hold times can sometimes during peak times be 20 minutes or more. But if we do that, we still actually do that. We're not required by law to do it, like many of the things in there, but it is the right thing to do, so we do that anyway within our employees. We do that. But some of those calls, and I mean, it's fine, but we sometimes, when it's that long, we do end up sometimes passing on the transaction because we have a 20-minute wait and we may not be able to.
Sir, if you're going to speak, could you come up closer? It's because we're recording this and we're probably having a difficult time picking you up back there.
I will say there have been a number of times where, even just this week, where stolen firearms are recovered.
Do you have a question, Mr. Dyson?
Yeah. You probably covered this, but well, our pawnbroker network includes the Valley.
So
Somebody steals here, they can go out and sell it to them. Put it out there.
right, so we don't have any authority to put, so at the way that stolen property is recovered here is we don't seize property from the pawn shops. We only have authority to put things stolen in our jurisdiction, pawned in our jurisdiction on hold.
All right, so I understood that the state had mandated something like that with pawn shops. I'm wrong? Often am. All right. And I have a couple more questions that'll come up in the general thing. Chief, years ago I did some work on police holding in evidence lockers, material that had been stolen and recovered. And the city of Anchorage was doing better than any other municipal law enforcement. But for us, there was a Asian couple that ran a shop out in Muldoon area. They had $10,000 worth of jewelry there on consignment. That sat in the evidence locker for a year and a half while they had to satisfy their client, and so on. So we changed some of the state law, but really push, verify, doing everything you need to do with the evidence, chain of custody, and all that kind of thing to get to that release. With some big construction equipment, it was really horrendous for small contractors and so on. But I assume we're still doing pretty darn good here.
So we don't actually seize property from pawn shops. It goes on hold at the pawn shop, and it can only be on hold for 60 days.
But I think with regards to your question about once property and evidence has something, whether an officer picks it up on the street and brings it in, I think we're returning that property to the rightful owners pretty quickly, and certainly as quickly as we possibly can. If it's recovered stolen property, unless there's some evidentiary reason that we can't give it back, and so if you don't know, if we serve a search warrant someplace and we seize that property pursuant to the search warrant, then we actually have to get the judge to authorize the release once we've seized it that way. And so that can be somewhat complicating, or if it's, it's evidence in the case other than above and beyond just the fact that it was stolen property, those kinds of things. But we work with the DA's office to release things as soon as we reasonably can, because we want property owners to get their stuff back. And as you all are very well aware, we have no ability to store stuff.
Right. And let me be clear, the stuff was stolen from the pawn shop.
Oh, interesting.
That was a different one. And before we leave this subject, maybe not yet, it's not quite appropriate. Are we looking at Craigslist and other things for stolen property to show up?
I don't think that we have any employee that's consistently surfing Craigslist. I suspect that Bethany probably does it on her own sometimes, depending on if she has if somebody contacts her and gives her really specific information to make it easy to identify some property, but as a general rule, we really don't have the ability to have employees kind of surfing online and looking for stuff.
My sense is that's unfortunate, but I mean, a buddy of mine that runs a very large boat repair shop had $16,000 of electronics stolen off the shop after two guys had come in and talked about business. He got online and found some of it within 3.5 days. That was new stuff in the box. And got your guys to help him go get it.
Good.
Yeah, but I'm not telling you business, Mr. Forbes.
Yes, thank you. I was just curious when a broker contacts the police department to see if the firearm serial number or other items been reported stolen, but databases are checking for these stolen items or items reported stolen. Is that statewide or national database?
So when they're calling for firearms, all firearms, when they're reported stolen by serial number, they're entered into NCIC, which is the National Crime Information Center. So that's a national database that dispatchers will check. Other items, depending on their value, get entered into a statewide database, which that's not something we're required to be called in. A lot of pawnbrokers do, but it's not something that we're asking to be required. Just firearms, which are always entered into the national database.
So my question is, do other police forces in other jurisdictions track what's sold online at different sites like that, or is that something that's just too time consuming and you just couldn't do it?
I think it'd be challenging for a lot of reasons. Just because something's on Craigslist doesn't necessarily mean it's stolen. I sold a brand new dishwasher on Craigslist that was still new in the crate, and pretty sure it wasn't stolen. But so I think that's the difficulty, right? Is just randomly cruising for things on Craigslist that are for sale. I don't know that would be super productive. I think that if if somebody comes to us, like the example that was given, and says, "Hey, I think I found my items for sale on Craigslist and they were stolen, and here's the police report number, and here's the way I can identify them," that's something that we generally try to follow up on if we can. But I'm not sure that just surfing it would. I'm not sure how productive that would be.
So the individual who had their items stolen would be advised to go look online themselves, and then if they find something they think might be right, then get a hold of Bethany or something? Or?
So often what happens is people go into pawn shops, and we've stacked my business cards with the pawn shops, and they're very good about referring people to me. And so when they're referred to me, I read their reports, all cross-reference reports. I look, of course, for pawn activity that's related, and I also make recommendations of other businesses, secondhand businesses they should check, websites they should check, and then I give them instructions on what to do if they do locate their property. If they have property that they have a serial number for, then they can differentiate that from anybody else's. The problem is often victims only have very basic information, and there's no way to say that that's your stolen item just because it's the right visual match. So you have to have some identifiers to be able to match that. But I do give instructions on what to do, and it's to call dispatch, ask for an officer, follow up to your case, to try and see if that officer can make contact with that poster on Craigslist or Pico or whatever.
Mr. Dyson?
Yeah. I would imagine that some people have built up a search engine that you can just tell them go look at Craigslist, and other ones for a 3-year-old Honda riding just with a lawnmower, and they go out and look and see if there's any in the area. But you know about that. All right, thank you.
Well, I think a lawnmower probably has some sort of manufacturer's number or serial number on it, so you could, if you had your original receipt and where you bought it from, you might be able to get that number tracked down.
Like I'm often contacted by construction companies, and they'll have spreadsheets with serial numbers, and I'll run every single 20-page spreadsheet. I'll run every serial number and try and see if there's been items that are pawned. There's just not really a way to do that on those online databases, because the format they have, they don't list serial numbers, they don't do that. There's not a searchable way to do that.
I see. Mr. Gunn?
Yeah, actually, I found my question. I'm looking forward to hearing from the industry's thoughts on the specific changes we're making, talking about this.
Okay. All right. So, Mr. Sherwood, do you want to continue?
Sure. So the next one is C3 on line 33, adding time. And I think it's actually more important than you might think. And
So the reason why we want to add time to be reported is because if we know the time the item was stolen and the victim doesn't have a serial number but they have make and model and it was pawned that same day, if it was pawned before the theft, obviously we can easily eliminate it. They don't have to call the pawn shop, get a manager, take them away from what they're doing to ask, hey, what time did this transaction occur?
And then C4, we just basically updated what would be required for a photo ID. Got rid of the reference to military serial number because it's just not relevant anymore, and pawn unit can't, doesn't have a way to research that anyway. We've had a little bit of offline discussion about adding something like passports, maybe tribal ID. It just requires a little more research, especially like tribal ID. I'm not familiar enough to know if that's got a photograph, because that's going to be the key, but something maybe more like we have in voting registration, as long as there's a photo ID and a valid government ID. I don't think anything on that. So let's go to the next page, and it's top, so this is page 3 of 9, section C8, line 2 through 4, references having a clear color photograph of each separate item of jewelry. And again, Bethany can tell you why that's important.
So when victims contact me about their jewelry, I have not one time found a single piece of property doing a descriptive search for jewelry, and I'll pass out some examples of how they're described. So currently, pawnbrokers do not photograph their jewelry. When he talks about where we get a picture of each piece of jewelry, there was a change to a second-hand merchants, precious crafted metal dealers, where they're supposed to photograph their jewelry. And what they do is they take a picture from up here of a clump of jewelry, so it's ineffective, basically. And they'll describe it as old jewelry. So I'm never going to find somebody's stolen property. And you can take a look at those descriptions. You can tell me if you could decipher what that is, or if that's something that you would know, by looking at that. Yeah, that's my stolen ring. I mean, I don't know how many people know the total weight in grams of their ring. I don't know. And if you look at the transactions, there are a massive amount of transactions each day involving jewelry at the pawnbrokers. If you look at the search date at the top of the first page, this is just 2 days worth of transactions. There's 64 rings that have been pawned. So if you've got a burglary victim and it's been a week, there's hundreds of transactions, and all the descriptions are like this. So you can see why a photograph, and many victims have photos of their jewelry. If I can and I can do an image search in this database.
Mr. Welke?
Okay, that's an important statement. You can do an image search. When we did the precious metals thing, we said if it's over $100, but and a lot of times a photo, when I even look at the descriptions, I mean a photo of this and a photo of probably 6 other wedding rings in this room, photo wouldn't help.
Right, but what I find is people that contact me, their rings are unique and they have many photos of them.
So how do you, so if they send you, so you have a written thing here, but when you file, when these, is this they file a police report? This is
No. So this is Leads Online. This is where pawnbrokers report their transactions. This is how I see the description. They're not currently required to photograph.
Okay, so this comes from
the pawn shops.
So they would upload quite a number of photos.
Right.
100 a day.
Right.
And then you get a report. You can file those some way, and if someone says, "Here's my wedding band,"
So
you
I
have
can
a way
do.
it'll match them.
Yes. So what I can do, Leads Online, this system has lots of search options. One of those is an image search. I can narrow it by a date range. I can narrow it by an image type. I can narrow it, the date range is going to be the easiest, and I can just scroll through and look if they're good images. And that would be far more helpful than this. And then if I do a descriptive search, like over time, I've been able to decipher a part of this. Like I know that the 10 carat is the carat of the gold. Like that MYG is Min's yellow gold. So I know it's yellow gold. The weight doesn't really help. The 11 is the ring size. And so I know that there's a round diamond in there. So I can decipher this and I can try and narrow that down. But what happens is I end up calling the pawn shops, asking an employee to take a photo of it with their phone and email it, a picture to me, so that I can compare it to the picture that the victim has given me and rule it out. It's very time consuming.
Which we do, we're not obligated to do. In many cases in the past, for many years, the actual either detective or a pawn clerk would be able to go to the location to view the piece themselves.
Could you introduce yourself so people know who you are?
Sure, my name is Brian Eddy. I'm the district manager that I operate the 6 Cash America pawn locations here in Anchorage. I worked in the city of Anchorage and for these pawn brokers for 15 years, so I've been involved with a lot of different, there's been quite a few different pawn clerks over the years and different ways that APD is operating with the pawn shops. But we do that, and I've been told by a lot of my employees that we have been doing that, and that's okay. It is time consuming. Obviously, we have staff. We're not obligated to do that, but we like to think we have a good relationship with APD. We do a lot of things that we're not required to do because it's the right thing to do as a business in the community and the industry that we're in. And we do those things, although it is labor intensive to do those things. And that's one reason why in our thoughts that there is a 30-day hold requirement for pawn brokers specifically, meaning that we can't resell anything. Unlike precious metal dealers, unlike secondhand dealers, it is against municipal code. There's no state law governing this, but the municipal code says that we can't resell anything, any pawn broker, for 30 days. The intention of that, in my opinion, of course, however many years ago that was written, was that would give ample time for law enforcement to investigate, view, seize, anything that they wanted to do, property, photograph it themselves, anything like that, before a pawnbroker could resell it. If it was somebody's stolen property, if it was needed to be investigated crime, used as evidence, anything like that. So, I mean, that's one thing that why we're against having required to upload photos, because of the equipment that we would have to install, that we would have to purchase, to upload the documentation, the labor that we would have to use to do that. That's our main opposition to color photographs being uploaded. We think with that 30-day holding period, that gives ample time for APD to come to any of our locations in Anchorage. It's a 10-minute drive from anywhere in Anchorage to look at the property if they want to photograph or view it themselves.
With all due respect, there's one of me, and there are hundreds of victims that contact each month for their stolen property. They have probably a list 20 pages long of stolen jewelry. It's just not realistic to have me drive to each pawn shop and look at this match and say, oh, nope, that's not a match, let me move on. And those are just the items that I am looking for, not cases that I actively work where I've found property, and those items have to be photographed, things have to be done on those cases.
Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was in regard to the requirement that there be a single photograph of a single piece of jewelry. In some cases, there are sets, a necklace and earrings. Earrings come in two. Do you just want one?
No.
A picture of one earring? Or?
No. So the reason that was specified is, like I said, there's the precious crafted metal dealers who take in a clump of jewelry and take a photo above, and you can't even see anything. So the reason why we wanted to specify that, if there's a set, if it's like a wedding set, then they're buying it as one line item. Like you can see on some of these tickets that more than one item was purchased under that transaction number. I just want each item under each ticket and line item to be photographed separately because what'll happen is the Cash Americas don't do this, but some of the other pawn shops will say like gold necklaces, and there's no description, really. There's nothing identifiable, and then they'll photograph like a clump of gold necklaces. So all I want is for each individual item to be photographed.
So you want them just separated, but it can be multiple pieces of jewelry in one photograph.
If it's
Just, yeah, like a ring, you know, you've got the wedding band and the
right, if they
engagement
take that
ring
in as one line item, like most of the time when it's a wedding set, they'll take it in as wedding set. They
Okay.
won't take it in as band and then this. So yes, just that one item that they are issuing that ticket and line item for. Like there'll
So
be
we
a,
might need to fix that.
so there'll be a ticket and then there'll be like a -1, -2, -3, -4, -5 based on how many pieces of jewelry they take in. But there needs to be a clear photo of each piece of jewelry.
Okay. So we might need to fix that because it says one piece of jewelry.
Mr. Weddleton?
So, where else in the country is there a requirement that each piece is more
Minnesota,
exact?
for
So
one.
they do it, and I think for Mr. Eddy, are you within your nationwide company? Have you guys worked through the logistics?
We operate in 24 states. Our parent company, we're a corporate organization. We're a parent company. We operate in 24 states, pawn shops, every state, and even municipality, county has different laws that varies. Out of the 24, one that we operate in that we are aware of does, and that's in Indianapolis, I believe.
And does that work okay? I mean, they have the system that you could piggyback on, or they teach you how to do it?
It's new. I mean, again, out of 24 states that we operate in, it's this one that we operate in. It's pretty new. There's been a lot of we had to invest in the technology to do that. But I've been told that yes, I mean, there's the beginnings of a process in place. It's expensive, it's labor intensive, to get in there. But yeah, I've been told there's a process in place. So there's a precedent for it.
Okay, continue, Mr. Sherman.
Going down to D, page 3 of 9, line 7. So some changes here. Instead of weekly, daily, we got rid of chief of police and put in police department to basically state the obvious, since the chief can't do it all. And then this line about when to report, so that it was each day no later than 11:59 p.m. Again, there's been some online discussion that likely will change in S version to 10 a.m. the day following, just because it works better within the workday. And then we deleted, the intention is to delete the part that talks about a form provided by the police department, which sounds too much like providing a paper form, and instead leave the language format acceptable to the police, which is really a reference to Leads Online. And Bethany may want to talk about that too, especially why the daily report.
So we have one pawnbroker that continuously fails to report their transactions within the weekly time frame. Sometimes they'll report at different locations transactions that's in Wasilla or Fairbanks. Sometimes they'll wait a month to report, and we had a lawsuit with them, so they're very non-compliant. And so I just wanted, there's a problem when they're waiting a week to report transactions. If something is pawned the next day after the theft, and something's pawned the next day, and then the victim has a serial number, and we can get that recovered and view that person's other transactions, then we can get it taken care of much more quickly. But when I've done a search for somebody and that's a suspect and they haven't pawned anything, then we move on. So there's a problem with taking time to report, and daily reporting is standard in almost every other jurisdiction.
Mr. Weddleton?
Yeah, I would suspect with modern technology, daily is not an issue. When I went through it, at 11:59, it's like, well, they're closing down their shop, they have customers in there, so suggested making it.
Right.
You're probably
no.
not working anyway, so.
And that's fine.
10 a.m. work or 8
It's
a.m.
just,
work?
yeah, whatever time, as long as it's within the next day. Excuse me. And most of these can be automated. It's nobody has to be at the store to actually do it. It can be automated with the software.
Ms. Kennedy, or are you finished, Mr. Wilson?
Well, can I follow
Go ahead,
up?
sure.
And kind of going on to the case you mentioned, so the person who's not complying now is definitely not going to comply with this.
Right, but we can find them.
But you can't now.
Well,
I mean, not that this is a bad change. I'm just kind of concerned here that you have someone who's doing a good job, and then someone who's way out of compliance, and they're not shut down.
so we've had discussions with them. The pond detective will go talk to them, and they'll be good for a week or a month, and then they'll fall out of compliance. And then there's question about who will enforce the civil part of this. Code enforcement has said that they don't have time or the people to enforce. But once we have, I think, these rules in place, there'll be more of an emphasis on maybe writing civil cites, like our detective writing civil cites against these businesses to get them, because once there's some sort of, repercussion, then I believe that they will be financial repercussion. There will be in compliance.
But
That would make
I
sense
look
to
for
me.
that. I mean, I'm not worried about the Cash Americas. I'm worried
No.
about that guy. And if you can't control that guy, I mean, stuff's
We have to
generally
find
fine,
them.
but we need to get on that and make changes.
Right. When they go to renew their business license and the administrative hearing office contacts me and they say, do you have any issues with this? I'll mention that, and then they'll be very good for 2 months just to get their business license renewed. So I think having the ability to cite them, I believe that will be done much more frequently, or it will be done with these changes, because I've sent certified letters to them, I've done things, and then they'll behave for a little bit, but then they'll fall right out.
Okay, continue, Mr.
Right.
Chairman.
And-
Or, excuse me, Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm looking at the all transactions, but I'm looking back at the beginning of C2, and it talks about the idea that it's each article that's pawned or purchased. So is that does that mean that somebody that walks in is just going in to shop?
No. So there
Okay,
are
so how do we
two-
make a distinction there? Because it says all transactions, so.
Well, there are two types of transactions that pawnbrokers conduct. So there's a pawn transaction, which is a loan.
Right.
And then there's a buy, which is a purchase. It's the pawn shop purchasing. And that's the distinction. The pawnbrokers purchasing. So those are buy transactions.
So is that just kind of already assumed, or do we need to be careful about
I
when
think
we're
it says
requiring all transactions?
I can
To be
answer that.
summarized. Okay.
This is all within Title 10, it's all within the rubric of the pawnbroker licensing ordinance that we have, and so, yeah, it's very safe to assume that this isn't talking about ordinary person coming in off the street and purchasing something that's ready for sale. This is strictly directed at people who have a pawnbroking license.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, continue.
So, going on to E, which is line 15, page 3 of 9, retention of records. They got to keep everything for a year, and that's always been the case. We just added an exception, which is video surveillance imagery, and you'll see in that they only need to keep for 90 days, which was just sort of a concession to the fact that that all adds up. It takes up space on the hard drive, so to speak. Anything on that? And then going on to F, starting on line 19, just adding that there can be a verbal as well as a written notification, and adding member of the pawn detail, which is a reference to Bethany, so it doesn't have to be an officer that takes in this information, which just makes their whole operation much more efficient, both that you can do it verbally and that it can be reported to the pawn court. Anything more on that? And then if we jump down to the bottom of that page to F4, and this was something all under this duties upon notification of property's been reported stolen. I'm pretty sure this was something that we added at the request of Cash America, because they and the other pawn shops got a look at a draft of this so we could get feedback, and this was something that was added at their request. Right?
Thank you.
So then, next page, 4 of 9, all of that remains the same. And then if we go to page 5 of 9 and L, starting at line 9, here we added a section having to do with duties upon notification by a person making a claim that property in possession of the pawnbroker is stolen. So again, in this case, the pawnbroker then is required to notify a member of the pawn detail, not just a police officer. So that way, Bethany's pawn clerk can be notified right away, because sometimes in this, and as it says at the bottom, notification can be made by phone or email, but time is of the essence. You want to talk about that and why that's...
So sometimes what will happen is victims, they don't know I exist. So they'll go into pawn shops and they'll find their stolen property. And it's not so much the Cash Americas, they'll find their stolen property and the pawnbroker will not tell them, oh, contact the police, they can assist you with this. They will tell the person, well, if you contact the police, it'll take months to get your property back. So you can just pay for it. You can just buy it. And so that's a big problem, because victims shouldn't have to pay to get their stolen property back. And again, that's not so much the Cash Americas. The only thing that really kind of happens at the Cash America locations is a victim will come in and say, that's my stolen property, and somebody who's probably not a manager, just an employee, will say, okay, well, you need to contact this person, or they won't say anything at all. They'll say, what I've had victims tell me is that they were told that they need to contact the police, and that's it. So I think this is an opportunity for the pawnbroker to get the ticket number of the item, the transaction number, email me, give me the victim's contact information, and then I can reach out to the victim and say, hey, have you filed a police report? If you have, what's the number so I can review it? Let's get this property on police hold so it's not out for sale, and so we can get this back to you.
Mr. Wilton?
Okay, I appreciate that. When I read this, I guess it's a little different, because in my company, we use cards and comics and things like that, and occasionally I have someone come in and my stuff was stolen, here's what it looks like, and we work to watch for it. But we always tell them right away, file a police report. And if they have one, and they can give me that number, then we hold it, and in a year, we get a couple cases where we get stuff returned. It goes pretty well, but we insist that they have that police report, because it's so easy to go online. But if we don't, one reason we do that is, and we follow pretty much the pawn law. We don't sit on stuff for 30 days, but we do the reports and stuff. And we have pictures with our photo video, but we have someone roommate could come and sell us something,
right?
And the other roommate comes and says, "Oh, my stuff is stolen. Oh, that's it right there.
Right.
Give it to me." And I go, "Well, now we're scammed, right?"
Right.
So I say, "Okay, well, file a police report, and then we'll talk to you."
Right.
And that generally sends people away. They'll come back. So, so it doesn't happen often. But.
Right. And what might happen is I try to follow up with that person. I don't see that because I can access the online reports, so I can see the pending reports that haven't been processed yet. So someone will contact me, and the report will be pending, and I can review it, and it was filed long enough ago that I don't think they're lying about this property. But I have had where roommates will steal from each other, and I'll ask them, "Oh, if you want to pursue charges against this person," they'll say no. I say, "Well, you know where it's at. You can go buy it, because we're not going to proceed with that because the pawn shop's a victim in that case." So that's why we require that they file a police report, and that's why I speak with them. I might put something on a verbal hold, but I won't release it back to the person without speaking to them and getting the victim's story.
Can I check with Mr. Eddy? So I've had that scenario I described, so someone comes in and says, "Hey, that's mine." Would it be beneficial to you say, "Okay, I'm worried about that, show me your police report," and have them, they could do it, you could lend them your iPad, they could do it right then.
Right, and I completely understand the spirit, of this being in there. I train, my people, we train, our company does, that Bethany, as she had mentioned, actually leaves her business cards at my locations that we actually hand out to people that do say rather than, because over the years, I mean, again, just saying, hey, call the police department, it's hard, a lot of people, a lot of patrol officers we found doesn't even know that Bethany exists, right? A lot of, and so we want to work with these victims to say, hey, who's the right person to get a hold of? And so she's given us our cards, we've done that. I'm a little concerned that we're, obligated by code and law to make sure to give the information to police department. I mean, we do that, we hand cards out. Having a police report maybe, could be beneficial. I mean, at the end of the day, we're still going to refer the police department. Never in our organization that I'm aware of have we ever asked somebody to pay for their item if it was stolen. And if I had somebody that worked for me that did that, they probably wouldn't be working for me for very much longer. Because at the end of the day, if somebody says something is stolen, we want to make sure that we do everything we can to help them get a hold of the right people and go through the right process so they can. That's part of being part of the community and the business that we are. But, there are instances where, like if you've got a roommate or something like that, comes in and say, hey, this is mine. Suddenly, we're going to get all the information. We're going to give it to the police department, to Bethany. Yes, maybe having a police report would be, but in many cases, maybe they haven't filed a report. That's our concern with that clause, but again, we'll still, be able to refer them to the police department and hold the property in many cases, even while they're trying to get a hold of somebody at the pawn unit in there, even though, which actually later on in this, I believe there is actually a provision for that's later on in there. But, yes, so that's our concern with that. And then we may, since the fine schedule that Bethany is mentioning in APD, there is some, if there's a bad pawnbroker or licensee that is unfortunately not complying, there is questions on what enforcement is going to look like, and ultimately that if for some reason, if there's something, are we potentially opening ourselves up to be fined if we don't report that information to the police department? Say that I have an employee that sends it, maybe via email or leaves a voicemail or calls the dispatcher and says, hey, this is their information. Maybe Bethany's on vacation, right? And then we leave a voicemail and suddenly we're non-compliant. We open ourselves up to a fine because of non-compliance. So those are all concerns that we have.
Well, it specifically says in here the pawn detail because any kind of case, I would review it or somebody at the pawn detail. So the only unit that would be fining you would be the pawn unit. So I don't see that would happen, where you would get fined for not notifying if you did in fact leave a voicemail or send an email.
We're running a little low on time, so we need to keep moving forward. Could you continue, Mr. Schuler?
There's not too much left. So the next part, page 5 of 9, line 19, section M, video surveillance, and this continues on to the next page. This is an exact copy and paste from the marijuana video surveillance regulation, except for the obvious changes to make it relate to pawnbroking. And you see in subsection 4, that's where the reference is that to be preserved for a minimum of 90 days rather than the year like the other things. I don't think there's much more to say about that since it comes from existing code with regard to marijuana. Did you have anything you wanted to add about just the importance of video surveillance?
So the reason why video surveillance is so important in pawn shops is because oftentimes people will ask somebody they know to pawn something for them. So they're suspects, right? They'll ask somebody to go in the pawn shop with them to pawn something, and then they'll pay that person some of the proceeds. So the reason video surveillance is important in that case is to establish that they were together and they, the person who stole it actually directed someone else to pawn it or sell it. Also, it's important because, people's IDs are stolen, and there have been cases where stolen IDs were used to pawn in a pawn transaction. And so you want to make sure that the person on video pawning something is the person whose information is recorded on the pawn ticket.
Mr. Whittleton.
That's really good. Can I ask a question, Mr. Admin?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's hard to find a retail store that doesn't have dozens of video cameras all around. Is this an issue for the industry?
No, not with us. We have many years. I mean, for just like any retailer, he's going to have video surveillance. There's some specific requirements in there, but everything we have existing fits in here. I don't know about the other 3 licensed brokers in town, but at least for us, it's not an issue.
Thanks.
Continue.
Going to the next page, page 6 of 9, line 10, section N. This just says that the pawnbroker has to make the records required, and references 1020.030 C1 through 9. Mr. Weddleton was kind enough to point out there was no 9, so the S version will change that to 8. Available for inspection by a law enforcement officer. And this is a pretty standard provision that we just happen to not have. It's also in state code, I believe. We didn't have it. Ours was originally written, as you can see there, although some of this goes back to the 60s. The last iteration was written in 95, and this just wasn't in there. So I'm going to talk about this one and O at the same time, because this one just allows someone from the pawn detail, so it doesn't have to be a police officer, just to go in and say, are you doing your record keeping? You're not looking at digging up evidence on any specific case. That's where O comes in, and O again comes out of the state statute, except for the reference on line 24 to video surveillance imagery, because the state doesn't have a video surveillance requirement. So with O is when there's a specific case that they're investigating, and in that instance, then the law enforcement officer has to basically say, well, here's the specific case, here's the case number we're investigating, and then is looking at things that specifically relate to that. Did you want to add anything?
Mr. Weddleton.
Yeah, 2 questions. One, can I ask something?
Go ahead.
So this has the phrase unredeemed pledged property. Do you know what that means?
I do. Unredeemed street, yes.
Okay, and that's a standard word.
It does. Yeah, so, and just to clarify really quick what Bethany was saying, there's 2 types of transactions that pawnbrokers do rather than a traditional secondhand store or buyer. We write collateral loans, and we also buy. But the transactions look almost identical with the merchandise coming in and what's reported to the police department. Somebody can come in with an item and they can borrow money against it as collateral, a piece of jewelry, something like that, and then we write a loan against it. We hold it for 60 days. They can come back, pay a fee, we give the item back, or they can just sell it to us. And the transaction looks very similar. The dollar amount exchanged, everything else. It's just if we purchase an item, they don't have the option to come back and get it back from us and pay the fee. Unredeemed pledge would mean a collateral for a loan, and that's industry standard terminology.
Mr. Sherwood.
And Assemblymember Weddleton, I did a little more looking on that. So that particular phrase is straight out of state statute, as is all of O, actually. And the state statute, from what I've heard, was basically written and requested by kind of a statewide pawn organization. So I think it's very much a familiar term as he's made clear within their industry.
And I had one.
Can I go on?
Well, I had so my layman's thing. So normally to go search, you need a warrant, but in pawn shops, you don't need a warrant. All you need is a case ID, and you can go in.
They're not seizing anything here.
And a warrant relates to seizing stuff.
Right.
Not necessarily.
Can be inspection of records, but this is I mean, to the degree it is that, it's an exception to the warrant requirement, but a very narrow, specific one that has to do with a heavily regulated industry. I mean, it's true in environmental cases. There's all kinds of things you have to, paper records you have to require an inspector to go and say, are you doing this and this and that?
Thanks.
Then
Ms. Zolotel has joined us, and Ms. Kennedy has a question.
Thank you. I guess I just want clarification on that too. So if this is just about them going in to see, inspecting to see that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, isn't this more of a code enforcement issue than a law enforcement issue?
Seems like it's both. That's just my opinion.
But you're saying that, I mean, I guess I'm trying to figure out just what you said just a bit ago about making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're recording what they're supposed to be recording. That's not really an investigative aspect. That's really just kind of an auditing kind of of an approach. I mean, it just seems to me like there's, if a law enforcement officer comes in and says, we have this case number, we're looking for this, can I check your records? I mean, I would think that would certainly be a legitimate request of a law enforcement officer, but if somebody's going in just to say, are you registering these and recording them properly, isn't that more of a code enforcement issue?
I think Chief Dahl wants to weigh in on that.
Okay.
So excellent question, and I think that the when we see ordinances that are designed with something like this in there, is to make sure that if we come across this in the course of those normal investigative duties that you're talking about, we have some ability to comply or to require compliance by the business. And so I think it's highly unlikely we would spend a lot of time going around town inspecting to ensure that people were in compliance with this. But I think that if we had an opportunity to have contact with a business because there was a criminal case going and then we found they were in compliance, now we have a tool to use to make sure that there's some penalty for not being in compliance. And that's actually not uncommon in other parts of the code as well. We see things where there are penalties set out, but it's not something that the police department's actually going to spend a lot of time doing like compliance checks on.
Right.
Just make sure that everybody knows that there is a penalty if you don't comply.
Okay, so, and can I follow up on that, please? And so do you typically find that there are pawn shops that don't want to do this and basically refuse to allow, just don't want to cooperate on this? I mean, is that typical?
That they don't want to follow, yes. There is one particular pawn shop that does not follow the reporting requirements on a consistent basis, yes.
And we're not finding them,
We were advised by code enforcement that they don't have the people available to do such a thing. So we talked to them and it improves at a certain point. The problem is the owners of that business do not ever respond to anything from us. But if we start finding them, if we have these stronger requirements and we start finding them, I imagine they will be consistently in compliance.
probably need to look into that. But anyway, okay, thank you.
So are you keeping track of some of these items we might want to amend on an S version, Ms. LaFrance?
Yes, thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Continue, Mr.
So
Chair.
two last quick things in section 2, and it's the same in section B and D. We've just added there as part of the process that name of the member of the pawn detail, and in D, officer, member of the pawn detail. But again, this is to allow the pawn clerk to take care of these things that are already existing in the code. And then the last part is just a fine schedule that applies to this. I don't have anything else.
And so are these fines the same as they were before, or this is new, or they've been increased?
I don't think there was a fine schedule before. So that was the case. Under Title 10, there is general language about kind of a minimum, maximum for anything under the licensing we do under Title 10. As I recall, the pawn code part of that did not have it specifically broken out like this, which is why everything's underlined there. Pardon?
I think you can just pay within the range.
Right. This makes it more, creates a firmer picture, you might say, which kind of goes back to what Bethany was saying, that if this gets passed, then you've got a much more specific tool to enforce.
Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. I appreciate this fine schedule. I think that will assist with compliance. I have a question for the sponsors. So I think this is on the 25th. Is that right? Is that when we hear this next? Is your intention to have an S version, or if there are a few amendments, if people want to run amendments,
Yes.
and then hope for passage on the 25th? Is that the goal?
Well, the intention is to have an S version. I know Mr. Sherwood has started that. And so if folks have an amendment ideas.
Hello, this is Christopher.
Could be good if we could get them into that version, and then I
Yep.
don't know how the body will feel, if additional time, will be needed for another work session, or if we can go ahead and debate and pass it at the next meeting.
Do you think we could get the S version before the, it's probably too tight to get it on the regular agenda, right? But we could get it on the addendum at least, so it's not laid on the table.
What do you think, Mr. Sherwood?
What would the date be?
Next Friday, right?
Yeah, so this Friday for regular, next Friday for agenda.
Yeah, for addendum shouldn't be any problem.
All right, we have one item left we're not going to be able to get to, but we did get a grant from the state to help us enforce some impaired driving. And I can believe we get that regularly.
We do. In fact, I'll say a couple things very, very fast about it. We've been getting it for several years. It's a pass-through grant. It actually originates from National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. It was originally designed to fund our entire operating under the influence enforcement unit. 6 officers, 1 sergeant, 1 clerk. It's about $1.7 million annually. And it's supposed to scale down every year to where we eventually own those positions and fully funded them. However, that unit's been so successful that NHTSA continues to fund it at 100%. So we're happy to have it. They're doing a good job, and it's 6 officers, 1 sergeant, and a clerk that is being funded by somebody other than us.
Great.
Fantastic. We're getting close to the end of our 2-hour meeting, so I think we have just enough time for audience participation if someone is interested. Mr. Haberman.
My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. I live in the Mexico Valley. I follow the public process. When the public process is not appropriate decision made by the governing body, is more like the public interest. This was a very informative meeting. Unfortunately, same procedure you've been following is you did do a notice with respect, a notice of the title of who you are, but the fact is what the agenda was a complete blank to the public. I did notice a member of the industry in reference to one of the items dealing with farm breaking was present, but I suspect that the reason why they came was some message got to them from another source, because as a member of the public, it's not on a notice to know that that item was before you. There's no agenda unless you came to this meeting and the material here. Also, initial part of the meeting was a number of statistics that were provided. It was very informative except for one key part. The documents that were provided at this meeting had no reference to preparing it, what date it was prepared, and so forth, and where it's coming from. It was presented verbally at this meeting, but none of those pages had any reference as when it was created and where it was going to. So, in fairness, that is not appropriate for materials coming for you or any public meeting. And that ends it, except that ends it because we're running out of time, and thank you very much.
We are adjourned.